Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here at the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. My name is Radhika Balakrishnan. I'm the faculty director for the Center for Women's Global Leadership at Rutgers University, and I'm a professor of women's and gender studies also at Rutgers University. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about how I came upon the idea of this particular group of women that we brought together. I was asked to do something for Women's History Month, and happy International Women's Day today. We should have it every day, but I'm glad we at least get one day. And I was asked to put together a show for Women's History Month, and I thought, well, what are the issues that we need to think about this particular moment in our history, given the kind of issues that we're dealing with both locally, nationally, and internationally. And so I came up with the idea of 3 people that I thought would be the best to be able to speak to issues that are global in nature, national in nature, who are sophisticated thinkers, and who will give us a feminist analysis on a really wide range of issues. And so let me then take this minute to introduce this great group of women. I'm going to start with Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini. She's the co-founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Network and spearheads Women's Alliance for Security, Leadership, dedicated to promoting extremism by promoting rights, peace, and pluralism around the world. On this side is Ejim Dike, who's the executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network. This is a national network of 250 organizations working to build a human rights movement and culture in the United States. Andrea Arroyo is a visual artist and a cultural advocate. She curates exhibitions on socially relevant issues. Her current project that I was very, very honored to go and listen to this weekend at the Brooklyn Museum is a tribute to the disappeared, honoring the victims of injustice around the world, featuring over 300 international artists, focusing especially on the students who were disappeared in Mexico recently. So this group of people have a lot to tell us. And so I think what I'll do is I'll start with each of them telling us a little bit about themselves and the work that they do, and then we'll get into a conversation between us. So Andrea, I'll start with you.
Yes, so I'm a visual artist, mostly. I do work that has to do with women and women's issues. I have been doing that for a long time. And I do work that is in different media, depending on the project. I work in painting and drawing and installation and large-scale public art as well. And I also curate. So I have been curating projects that focus on socially relevant issues like September 11th, like immigration, like women's rights. So I do that a lot, and the latest project my current project is Tribute to the Disappeared. It's 300 artists from around the world, and it focuses on disappearances, both literal disappearances, forced disappearances, where people are actually taken, but also non-literal disappearances, that, things that are done through discrimination and racism and injustice. So I'm mostly a visual artist. I curate on the side, and I'm also a cultural advocate. I do believe that art can change the world.
Excellent. Ejim, you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yes. Okay, let me start by saying a little bit more about Andrea.
Excellent.
I was just telling her earlier that, in fact, sad to say that the first time I heard about femicide really happening on a systemic basis in Mexico was through Andrea and her art. So she's an artist, social activist. I'm proud to know her. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the United States, because that's the work I do. We focus the network, which is where I've worked now for 4 years, I guess, and been a member since it started, focuses on the fact that the United States is not exceptional. So in fact, we're part of the global community, surprise, surprise. And so we have human rights violations here in the United States. like we have everywhere else in the world. So I've been doing human rights work now for about 15 years. I'm a really big believer in doing work to change the community you live in. Some people might also see from my name that I'm Nigerian, which is where I grew up, and which is really where I formed my political ideas. So I'll be hopefully doing a little bridging as we talk.
Good. I was hoping you would. Sanam?
Thank you. First of all, it's lovely to be here. So what do? I currently run an organization, and we have a very flat network structure with women's organizations, women-led organizations across the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, in 15 countries and expanding. And we specifically work with women who are active in their communities or at a national level on issues of peace building, de-radicalization and rehabilitation of boys who've joined militias, women's rights, obviously, justice, social justice, and democracy, and specifically in countries that are affected by conflict and violence and closed political space, so places where you have authoritarianism. The last few years, since 2010, I've been specifically working in this, this sort of cross region of Asia and the Middle East. I'm Iranian by background, so we kind of took Iran as the center point and said, okay, what do we do around it? But really, my interest has always been, over the last 20 years, in the courage of women who arise in the middle of wars, or especially at the beginning of civil wars, and basically decide to look after their communities and advocate for peace without using guns. And so a lot of my work has been, on the one hand, identifying these women in various countries, so Syria, Libya, Yemen now, but previously Liberia, Sierra Leone, Kenya, or globally, and connecting them to the global and international sphere. And I think the reason why I do that is because I feel in my own sort of self a sense of being a bridge. I'm Iranian by background. I grew up in England. I've lived here. I've been married to an Italian. I've worked all over the world. So it's like this notion of multicultural within yourself, and so understanding that you can be a bridge between these different notions of the global and the local and that context, but bringing those voices into the international sphere.
Absolutely. I think that's something that all four of us have in common, is that we're all sort of global and local all at the same time. I'll take this opportunity to let you know a little bit about myself, other than just sort of the titles that I gave you. I was actually one of the founding members of the U.S. Human Rights Network. One of the best things I ever did was to get Ejim to agree to be the network director.
She hired me.
And have worked, actually the two of us were in Jordan together at a meeting working on extremism in the Arab region. I myself am an economist by training and an activist by day. And so I use whatever I can in terms of the knowledge of economics to the service of people's activism. And so I do a lot of popular training. The center that I'm the faculty director, we do work on gender-based violence. We also work on, again, this sort of bridge building of bringing local issues to international spaces so that the local voices get heard, and in particular on economic and social and cultural rights and the human rights framework. I'm sure we'll learn more about each other as we go. Let me now sort of set up a question, and you guys are going to take it wherever you want. And Ejim, I'll start with you. Given the current state of the world right now, and all the complexities that we're dealing with nationally, globally, we're in a strange place, I think, at least in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. And it's Women's History Month. Yeah. What do you think are women's issues?
Okay. So let's see. What's not a woman's issue, I guess, is the question. We have a lot of, it's interesting because we talk to funders sometimes who are really interested in supporting women's groups, and they come to us and they're like, okay, what groups within your network? We're a national network of actually closer to 300 now groups that are around the US. which groups are doing work with, not with women, but on women's issues? And I'm like, they all are, because every issue is a woman's issue, right? So I would say this, some of the things that we've been thinking a lot more about lately within the network are globally economic issues. Because as you know, and you've come out, in fact, Radhika came and gave some really, really interesting workshops to our membership on economic and social rights. And it's something a lot of people don't understand, but a lot of our members understand that economic policies have an impact on their life. So the segregation of women into low-paid work, the concentration of women, I should say, also into low-paid work, the lack of supports in the workplace, that's the lack of affordable childcare. Those are some global issues that women are dealing with. I want to touch on two, and we'll talk a little bit more about this.
Take your time.
So, I don't know how many people watched the debate on Sunday.
Which one?
The Democratic debate, yes. Yes, it's the first one I got myself to watch, actually. There's a lot of talk about Flint, Michigan. Why? There's been lead poisoning in Flint. To hear them debating, you would think that this is the first time we've had an issue with poisoning of water in the United States, or with access to water, to human rights to water and sanitation in the United States. Just in Detroit, not too far from them, just next door, last year they had 33,000 families shut off of water because they couldn't afford the rate hikes. So the issue of water is something, and water and sanitation is one of the issues that we've been working on a lot. And this is not just happening in Michigan. It's happening in Baltimore. It's happening in Boston, where the rates have gone up. Sometimes, some communities in California, it's gone up 500%. Communities are paying 20% of their income to buy water. How is this a woman's issue? Well, first of all, I mean, women, like everybody else, need water for basic survival. But also, a few things have happened that I think are interesting. Beyond general caregiving and the fact that women need water more for hygiene purposes, especially when you're pregnant or nursing, is that whether we like it or not, women are also disproportionately giving care in the home. So I want to end on this story because I don't want to hog the mic, as you will, if you will. You can't hear me? Oh my gosh. So I should speak louder? Okay. So this is the story I want to tell because I think it brought home to me how water is really an issue. In some communities in New Mexico, there's one community in particular that's surrounded by 3 uranium mining sites, right? And their water has been poisoned, particularly the people have known that the mines and the waste from the mines were toxic for decades. And the US government has refused to clean up the waste from those mines. So first, they were worried about the men who are predominantly the ones going into the mines. Then they started noticing that the women were getting sick. Why? They were getting sick from washing their husbands' and their sons' clothes after coming back from work. So it's just this inescapable. All these issues are, in fact, whether you're losing a child to some disease because he or she is exposed to toxic water, or whether whether you yourself are getting sick, or whether you're in some places in Detroit, you're in danger of losing your home because you cannot pay for your water bill. It's an issue that affects us all, and it's an issue that if you look at it, it disproportionately has a disproportionate negative impact on women.
Excellent. Andrea, I'll have you answer the question next.
Well, so many issues. I'm just going to talk about what many artists are dealing with right now. They're tackling the issue of femicide, the prevalence of femicide in this day and age. The rates are just heartbreaking and unbelievable. In Mexico, there's 6 femicides a day. And it started a long time ago, but it's been going on for a long time, since the 1990s, around the border of the U.S. and Mexico, when the maquiladoras came into Mexico and they set shop there. Started happening there systematically and every day. So many artists are dealing with this issue right now, like 20 years, 30 years later. So it's something that is very brutal and very clear. But then again, I also think of something that is closer to home. It can be just violence against women, or even the wage gap.
Mm-hmm. Sanam?
So we are dealing with the problem of extremisms, and I call it extremisms because so much of the discussions that we hear in the media and the mainstream media is basically about ISIL or Daesh or the sort of Islamic things, but actually women's groups, women's movements have been seeing the rise of these violent movements across the world, and they use religion as a cover. I mean, religion is a very effective way of trying to mobilize people, but we see it in Latin America with the evangelical and Catholic movements. We are seeing extreme Buddhism. Extremisms of various forms, and one of the reasons why we're seeing the rise of these movements and an acceleration is because for the last 30 years, we've also, and this is where it connects back to the US in terms of foreign policy issues, is that the US has been instigating what I call extreme capitalism out in the world and at home, right? So this incredible wealth inequality gap, lack of social welfare, structural adjustment policies that you know very well about that deal with, no more, poor education, poor healthcare systems, and so forth. And in all the places, and in the Middle East, we're seeing one version of it, but around the world where I've worked, when you leave a vacuum and you're not providing healthcare, the state is no longer there to provide healthcare, and the state is no longer providing education, and the state is a perpetrator of violence with its own police, somebody will fill that vacuum. And in a lot of these cases, it's these religious organizations. And ironically, they've actually captured the human rights agenda in a strange way, because they are providing the basic services, right? Yes. You can't deny it. Absolutely. They provide healthcare for people who need it. But they're coming with an ideology. And that ideology in particular is a challenge, because across all of these major, and as I say, the ones that particularly have a religious veneer or an ethno-nationalistic veneer, they have an issue with us as women. Right? They have a particular ideology about what women's status should be in society, and I think that's why in your region you see femicide. In our region, we're seeing women's rights activists, women's human rights defenders being assassinated, being threatened. They don't want women speaking out. They want to co-opt women because they understand. Actually, ironically, they understand the power and influence of women.
Absolutely.
Right? They know that women can be effective within their societies and within their families and so forth, and they want women to be the channel for that particular ideology. So when you have women who are standing up against it, it's a real threat. And the problem that we have internationally is that we have a lot of rhetoric that talks about how important women's organizations are and important. I've been involved in 2000, since 2000, we got a Security Council resolution that said women should be at the peace table, women should be involved in peace processes. That came from grassroots movements, that was a campaign. We have plenty of rhetoric, but we actually don't take it seriously. If you look across, whether it's Yemen or Libya or any of the places, the United States, where are the women at women's movement, feminists, on the questions of peace and security and defense expenditure and so forth? Because that's really what we're talking about. And it's the tendency is to co-opt and expect women to go into those systems and just be the same. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at. And just one point that for me is really, really interesting is that I kind of consider myself coming from a long legacy of very strong, empowered women, family and and my history and so forth. So I was, for me, getting into the realm of peace and security was really important because that's the last bastion of male dominance. It's the military guys, and and what I find extraordinary is that these movements constantly want to pull us back so that we're worried about our own bodies, right? It's like I have to worry about whether I'm covered or whether it's reproductive health. It's they keep wanting to circumscribe the space and the issues that we work on, and it's almost and by pressuring us, it means that we're distracted from the big picture issues. And so I think that within our movements, it's so important to be looking and making sure that there are many, those of us who are looking at big economic problems or big peace and security issues have the space to do that, and we're not being pulled back, and we're coordinating with the ones that are doing the more, basic fundamental rights issues, because otherwise it's like a distraction, and they're merely doing what they want, spending what they want, changing the world as they wanted, and pulling us along.
Go ahead. I wanted to pick on something she said, but I'll say it.
Go ahead. I'll come back.
No, because Sanam, you mentioned extremism, and I always feel like it's my duty when people mention extremism to talk about, like you said, extremism in the United States. There's extremism around capitalism. But we also have quasi, if you want to call them religious extremists in the United States. And, I think it just irks me when I hear U.S. politicians talk all the time about, we've never experienced terrorism at home. When if you ask any black person who's lived here since before the 60s, and many today at the hands of the police, they've experienced extremism, whether it's state extremism or it's racist extremism. And in any case, it's something I feel like I should always mention and never want to miss the opportunity to say.
Absolutely. And I think, when we talk about, I started this with a question about what are women's issues, and I think you all rightfully said, what isn't a woman's issue? But I think a feminist perspective on issues is very different from what's a woman's issue. And I think that's what we're trying to say here, is that there's a particular take we have. And so that when we look at, let's say, economic policy, and we have a feminist analysis of economic policy, that analysis is different from just saying, we have inequality, So one of the things that I would say is the level of inequality in the world right now is unconscionable. Oxfam put out a study a few weeks ago that said that 60 people have as much wealth as half the world's population. Yes. 60 people, all right? That's a bad enough number. But in 2010, 388 people had the same wealth as everyone else. That number shrunk to 60 from 388, right? So imagine when they said the rich are getting richer, we are seriously getting richer. Yes. And so, so we can say that there's inequality, but then on the other hand, we also have to look at the way in which finance capital is now running the world in terms of what are the issues that are driving what you're calling extreme capitalism. It's finance and the influence of finance. And so you look at the increase in the top 0.001%, and then what you see is a complete deterioration in wages of everyone else. And so, this level of inequality is also creating a huge angst. And if we talk about extremism, many of them are running for president right now. Yes. Right? In many countries you say, oh my God, the religious right is running for government. Well, we have the religious right running for government, and somehow we can't quite name it in the same way that you do in other parts of the world. So that level of inequality and what it does to the population is a really important thing. And the places in which the religious organizations step in when there's a vacuum of government is really critical. We saw that in Katrina. Absolutely. There was no government. The religious organizations came in. Absolutely. With their own agenda. So the role of the state and the economy has a lot to do with who gets to govern. And as all of you have said, the particular control of women's bodies and women's voice is pretty much the same. I do a lot of advocacy work at the UN, and you sit at a table and you're like, why is the Vatican sitting there with Saudi Arabia? Like, I thought they didn't like each other, but when it comes to women's issues, they bond. I mean, they
Absolutely.
completely
Absolutely.
are together in terms of what
Yeah.
they want to suppress. So I think it's really important. And the one last thing I wanted to say in terms of Ejim, in terms of sanitation and water and sanitation, I think this issue of water and sanitation, other than sort of the global problems, I
Yes.
mean, in a lot of our I think in wars, we talked a lot about oil and the reason for wars, it's water now in terms of that, but safety and sanitation in terms of women's issues is
Oh,
incredible.
yes,
I'm doing a project right now where we're looking at, in Pakistan, and we're looking at what is inhibiting women from being able to go to work.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's because they don't have access to sanitation. Girls drop out of school right around puberty because there are no bathrooms, right? And so when you look at women's issues, something as basic as sanitation
Absolutely.
is critical.
Absolutely.
That you look at the statistics, and girls right around puberty all drop out of school, or their absenteeism is higher, or whatever it is. And so I think all of these issues are incredibly linked.
The other thing that's linked to the water and sanitation issue, speaking of economic policy, is privatization.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I didn't talk about that. Because, in fact, what has driven up the water rates in some communities is because those systems were privatized. That's certainly what happened.
Absolutely.
And, in fact, what's even in places where the water is being polluted,
That's right.
it's also because private companies have, you know, what do you do? If you're a company that's making profit, you prioritize profit. It's no, you know. So it's why we shouldn't have profit-making entities in the business of distributing what we are, public services and goods, because they're at
Absolutely.
odds with each other.
So I completely agree with you. You knew that I would. And I think that gets us to issues also about what the role of the state is and what the state should be doing, but also in terms of regulation,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we need to talk about regulation globally and nationally, and how we as feminists need to be able to understand the regulatory framework to understand what it is, how our lives are affected. Now, we've kind of spent the first part of our conversation outlining some of the issues, but one of
I
the
have another issue, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I feel like I should mention this because Andrea, you talked about femicide. And, you know, so let me preface by saying this. At the network, we really are always trying to prioritize leadership by people most directly impacted.
Absolutely.
And also raise up issues that are not typically talked about. And so that's why I want to also talk about what happens to transgender women in the United States. Because this has been, there's a silent epidemic happening, and it's barely covered in mass media. One of the things that I thought of when you were talking about femicide is the fact that last year, 21 transgender women trans women were killed, murdered. And it's a group that's particularly targeted for hate crimes because people believe, I think Sanam, you said it, Andrea, you said it also, that they shouldn't exist. They shouldn't be in the streets. So I wanted to make that point because I feel like I don't want to forget
Absolutely.
to say it. And, you know, as you get to a certain age, you start to forget.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a different question.
Okay.
Which is that we've talked about sort of all the kind of issues that we're plagued with in the world, and as I said, it's an interesting time in world history. But one thing I do know that all of you do is work with some amazing people who are trying to affect change in this world. And I think that is what gives me hope and keeps us moving on. So Andrea, I want to start with you. I mean, you could talk about your current project and other projects and how artists are activists and examples of the resilience of us in trying to deal with this kind of insane world that we live in. So why don't we start with you?
So I believe artists are connectors, right? And right now we're living in a totally globalized world, so we have to connect to each other. There's the issue of femicide, there's an issue with the kidnapping of girls in Nigeria. There's so many different issues around the world, and art has the power to actually connect. I'm just gonna tell you a personal story. When I started Tribute to the Disappeared, I went to a public demonstration about the students that were kidnapped from Ayotzinapa. And I was in Union Square, and I was there, and there was maybe 100 people, and they were demonstrating, and they had signs, and they were making speeches, and I felt really disconnected. And this is just my own issue, but I just didn't feel the connection. And I left, and I was crying, and I was upset, and I was on the subway, and I said, there must be something, right, I can do to connect. And that was for my own healing. It wasn't really even thinking about anything else. So they used to have a demonstration every Sunday. So the next Sunday I was very hesitant to go because I had felt so disconnected the week before. And I just forced myself because it's an important issue, and I needed to be there. So I went to my studio, I got a tote bag, I got some paper in and some Sharpies, and I just left home. And on the subway, I started writing the names of the students on strips of paper, right? I didn't know what I was doing. I was just writing these names. I got to Union Square, and I asked people to help me finish all of the names. And I asked them to help me pin all of these strips of paper to my coat. And I walked around Union Square like wearing this kind of wing set. And then people came, and they were asking questions, and they were connecting, and people were telling me their stories. And I thought, art has just this power to connect people. And it's very different when you approach an issue through art and creativity, because people let their guard down. Usually when you talk about an issue that is brutal, and you talk about injustice, and especially if it's something that happens somewhere else, or people think it's somewhere else, it's not easy for the general public to connect. People generally just say, well, that happens there because the circumstances are different, and it's a violent country, and there's corruption, and there's this and that. And I think art has this power of making us think about the connections. And for me, Tribute to the Disappeared is about making those connections, and making underlining the fact that our personal choices impact globally. So whatever happens here has an impact in what happens in Mexico, in South America, in Africa, everywhere. So for me, it's about personal responsibility and that connection.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
You mentioned the question of regulations and so forth. For me, one of the things which is interesting is that we look at the global structure, and as I said, I started, advocacy. I was in, we said, let's get a Security Council resolution that recognizes women's voices in peacemaking. If the Security Council acknowledges this as international law, therefore, governments will have to adhere to it. Now, that the policy or the language and the parameters that's been set by a resolution like that, and now we have 8 of them, is really important because it helps it's almost like a sort of waterfall effect. You have more, it's a ripple effect of having more and more people talking about these issues. So 15, 20 years ago, nobody talked about women at the peace table. My mother used to think I was crazy. Now, Hillary Clinton's talking about it. So it's you see that shift, but we don't see it in practice. And I think what it is that on the one hand, it's about power. So women, and I think women's activists were very good at doing the technical work and the research and really playing by the book and thinking that if we get the laws in place and so forth, but this isn't, at some deep level, it's actually not about those issues. It's about power, and it's about relations, and it's about sexism, and it's about deep exclusion that they want. So that's one thing. The other side of it, which is where I think it touches with the artists, is that what I find with the women that I work with is that they are so incredibly creative. Peace builders have to be creative. It's looking at a mess and imagining something different. Right, that's what I love about the work that I do. That I look at a problem, and everyone's saying, "Oh, we must try and understand the problem," and we're like, "Let's look for the solution." There's a creativity about it, which is extraordinary. And I think that by combining that with music and arts and visual ways of telling the stories. As human beings, we love stories. We're storytellers, right? So if we can bring the two together, it touches the heart as well. So it's not just an intellectual exercise. It becomes about really talking to the emotions. And frankly speaking, when we're talking, for me, when I'm talking about war and extremism, it's personal and it's human. Right, and this is one of the challenges that we have, that when you bring it to the United States and you take it to Washington, it becomes a debate about whether somebody should have voted for or against the Iraq War in 2002. It's a legal thing that they did. Tick the box, yes or no. Imagine the connection. I mean, imagine the sort of the visual aspect of that vote, and then what it means for Iraqi people on the ground, not only in 2002 and 2003 but today. For us, it's past history. For Iraqis, it's today present and tomorrow, because they're still dying. Absolutely. Right? And it's a very human story, and it's children, and it's old people, and it's people like our grandmothers and our kids, and so we need to bring that human face. And when you bring that, it's very hard to do it because bureaucrats and politicians and diplomats it's almost like they lose that aspect. But when you, as women, when we do bring that perspective in, it has a tremendous transformational impact, actually, in a lot of the places. In Liberia and everywhere we've seen that women have been able to use that. It's changed the dynamics. In Colombia recently, with victims groups going and talking about what it means to be victims of both government and FARC and paramilitary violence. So I think that's where the connections are really, really critical for us.
Yeah. Ejim, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to now. Sanam has me thinking about so many other things. So shoot, let's see if I can remember. Let me riff off of what you were saying, Sanam, because I had a question earlier. Let me say this: in our work, we find the most effective communication to be actually reaching people's hearts rather than their minds. So I mean, it's hearts and minds, but you have to reach the heart first, because I think sometimes, especially when we're talking about security or a lot of other issues, we hide behind the numbers, so it becomes so impersonal, and you forget that you're actually talking about people's lives and human beings. And I think it's easier to make certain kinds of decisions if you're not talking about the people who are really being affected. And I think that's what artists do. And I think that it's interesting, because in some way I see a connection is what women tend to do, is the same thing. I did have a question, though, because you were saying earlier about having women at the table, and I wonder if this is the case, if this is ever the case, that women come to the table and almost want to play a patriarchal game. In other words, almost want to act like the men who are at the table and with power.
So what we know from the research and experience is that when you have women coming together as women's organizations or women's movements, right? So the power comes in bringing, let's say, Israeli and Palestinian women together, or Catholic and Protestant women across the division in Northern Ireland, and providing the spaces for them to be able to talk about the experience of war and violence, not based on their religious or ethnic identity, but as women, right? And all of a sudden you find that it doesn't matter, you're Catholic or Protestant, when there is war out in the street, the domestic violence comes home. When your husband or your father or your brother has been disappeared, your issues are the same. So the first thing is that it's where women have had the space and the time to be able to put aside those other identities and find their common identity as women, and then been able to come together in that context into the political space. Because what's happening, again, with we pass a law, as I say, you get a Security Council resolution. The way it then gets implemented is to say, oh, well, let's get the government of Syria to bring a couple of women, right? Because the government of Syria they may be great, but chances are they're going to have to toe the party line. And then, our whole paradigm shift for us is to say, with these wars, because they've become so complicated and you have so many different actors, it's not enough just to bring the warring parties. You need to bring the non-warring and the peace parties, and that can be women, it can be youth, it can be the business community, it can be doctors, and I mean, peace is a societal process. It's not just a political process. It has to have these other alternative voices in there, and that's a 21st century paradigm that we've never actually had in diplomacy, in a sense, and it's exciting, but at the same time extremely challenging.
What role does, sorry, I have a bunch of questions. What role does class play? Because let me preface and say that I remember a rather funny incident back a few years ago, a few decades ago, when the First Lady of Nigeria started an organization called Better Life for Rural Women, right? And so they would show up at the United Nations, and all these women who were from NGOs in Nigeria and who were supposed to be representing rural women were actually the elite in Nigeria, who probably only go to rural areas once a year for some religious activity or whatever. So I wonder, often you see that, and in our network here in the States, we're constantly, I talked about leadership by people most directly impacted. Even within the human rights community, that is always a struggle, because the people who have access, the people who have the language of the policymakers tend to have better education, more money. So I'm just wondering if that plays a role in terms of, in both your work, but.
So let me interject a little bit in that. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's why I think we have to distinguish between women's organizing and feminist organizing.
Yes.
And since we're on cable, I'm going to use the F word, feminist. And I think that's a very particular aspect of it.
Yes.
Because I grew up in Mrs. Gandhi, India. So having a woman leader does not mean that's a good thing. It is a different thing, because I did as a child know that a woman could be prime minister. But then as a young adult realized that could actually mean emergency and, persecution of people. So I think it's a complex issue. And I think the class issue is important globally as well. And recently, I went to India, and I was invited to a conference organized by the government of the state of Kerala, which is a state in southern India that's known for its human development record and others. But now they've taken on sort of gender equality as something important for the state. And I went and met with an organization in Kerala called Kudumbashree. And this is dealing with the class issue dynamic, not sort of UN people, but on the local ground. This group has members in every single district in the state, and they organize themselves. And I was very lucky to be invited to attend one of their meetings. And it was amazing. You have to be sort of the most affected to belong to this group. And one of the examples, and I just had to tell this because when you said it, is that they said, we were working and they were doing all this organizing. All the government canteens are now run by people from this group. And they said, there was this woman that we would see, and she had a house and she was married, and she even had someone who came and cleaned her house. And then we realized that she actually had no say in anything in her house. And so we, in Kudumbashree, we could go out, we were outside, we could occupy public space because we work, and these women were not allowed out of the house. And so the organizing of these women actually went and knocked on the door and said, will you come to one of our meetings? And the meetings were not meant for the elite women. And then this one woman came up to me and goes, that was me. And that was me who they brought here. And she said, and she was there, and she said, my husband, he cheats on me, what could I tell you? But I now have a space. So I think even that divide is about the organizing, right? I mean, I think sometimes we say, oh, it's the elite that are doing this and not this. But this is a group of women that I met just in November who were actually saying our organizing is helping the elite women understand what they're lacking and their inability to do that. But completely agree with you that we do need to look at the class issues, especially at these international arenas, because it's not the most affected that show up, and it's
so for us, we also take another angle, because I've come across plenty of feminists who are not pro-peace. And that's the other issue.
Yes.
that you know, and this is one of the challenges that when you get, women's peace movements that have emerged indigenously and authentically and kind of just from organically, tend to, for example, if you look at Liberia, as I say, if you look at Northern Ireland, if you look at Guatemala in the past, South Africa, they've had a mixture of elite and non-elite, and to me, what's important is what is the core value base that they're coming forward with, right? And and again, it's a heart issue. So many of the women that we see become peace activists. I have a colleague who's Sri Lankan. She has, education-wise, I think she has a high school degree, right? Her son went missing. He was in the army. He went missing, and she led a group of mothers into the jungle to go and talk to the Liberation Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, who were extremely violent at the time, without weapons, without security protection, they just did it as mothers. Now, they knew exactly what identity to use and what their power was, right? It wasn't the UN coming in saying, or the US government, as we see now, saying, oh, mothers are really important. It was them understanding their own cultural context, understanding what their goal was, and using what was their multiple identities and saying, okay, we're going to go in as the mothers of the disappeared and deal with this. And I think in Latin America, we've seen this as well. So it's really about the values of, do you have people, for me, the people that I like to, the ones that I am inspired by and I engage with are, it's what are they doing? What are their core values around equality, around human rights, around nonviolence, and around the vision of the society that they want. And I don't care whether they're literate or they have or illiterate, whether they have a PhD or not. I'm interested in people who are creative and have, as I say, have a can-do attitude. And what I'm amazed about is how often you find them at every level. They can, it's just crises brings out the best and the worst of people. And that's to me what is, my job. And if it's to elevate and amplify and echo those voices as much as I can.
Well, speaking about class, in general, the art world tends to be elitist. We all know that. But around the world, there are, women especially are doing some things that are extremely creative and beautiful. There's a group that started in Mexico that is called Bordamos por la Paz, We Embroider for Peace. And this group of usually women, they go into a public plaza on a Sunday from 12 to 1, and they sit down and they have handkerchiefs and they have thread and they have a couple of people who are there to train other people to embroider. And what they do is actually they embroider cases of femicide and disappearances. And this is a public event. So it's art that is actually taken to the streets, and everybody's invited to participate. The community is there, children and grandmothers and men are embroidering. And for an hour or two, people are actually focusing on this and creating this beautiful, beautiful thing that actually creates beauty out of something that is horrible. And it's that level of engagement that doesn't happen many times at a museum or a gallery level. So in that case, women are always leading these kinds of movements, these kinds of art collectives, like going into the streets and bringing the art outside.
Can I just,
because I do want to say a couple things. So one is that in my experience, it's generally, if I think about people who inspire me and keep me going in the work on a daily basis, it's women, and it's women who have this value of seeing the intrinsic value of human beings, irrespective of what your life experience might be. Having said that, it's also, I think, important to recognize that women are not all in the same boat, right? So we're talking about class, but if you think about, I would say globally, but certainly in the United States, race plays a huge role in it. And in fact, I've been in spaces where, in our membership, where people are insistent that they don't want to set aside their identity. Right? Because, in fact, it's by setting aside the identity that we miss the boat on some key policy issues. I think the feminist movement in the 70s made that mistake, that they were focused on issues that affected primarily middle-class white women. Absolutely. And you see it play out over and over again. Even when I hear people laud the Affordable Care Act in the United States, which is a great step forward in some ways, especially when it comes to birth control, access to birth control, and not seeing pregnancy or things like that as an existing precondition. What people often forget, and there is a divide by race often when people talk about this, is the fact that women, that the Helms amendment is attached to it. So if you're a low-income woman, you cannot afford
Yep.
government funded abortions. So you have your reproductive rights that are being denied. And that also immigrants, especially if you're undocumented,
Absolutely.
no matter how much money you have, you can't, you know, you're not allowed to buy or purchase health insurance through the exchanges, which has had an impact on immigrant women. So all that to say that it is also quite important to recognize the different situation and experiences that women have, and to make sure not just to recognize and acknowledge it, but to make sure that those women are at the table helping us form our policies.
Just a couple of things to add. So one of the things, again, that we find in our work is that when we're advocating and saying, you know, why aren't there Libyan, Syrian women at the peace table, for example, or you can take any country, frankly. The response is often, well, you know, these ones are too elite, or oh, they're too grassroots, they're not qualified. You know, we're looking for qualified women. They never ask that about men. I mean, you're never told, oh, these guys are elite, or no. It's basically the Taliban is violent. They get to come. They can be a bunch of illiterate 15-year-olds, frankly, which is often what they are. And so the logic right now is that basically, if you're Afghan women, maybe we should arm you, make you extreme, you know, allow you to be extremely violent, and then we'll come chasing after you to say, come to the peace table, right? There's a sort of irrationality around the double discrimination. So that's one of the reasons why, for me, it becomes about, you know, let me first understand the whole context before we criticize and critique the women. I come from a country where elite women led the way and did, you know, it was part of the responsibility. I mean, even if you look at Mary Poppins, right? That the lady of the house is out, you know, with the suffragettes, but she has a whole household of women looking after the kids and so forth. So there's a connection, I think, that's there. One of the things that I find when we bring these issues to the United States is that I call it the sort of the axis of cronyism, sexism, and racism that we often come across. So very often there's sexism, blatant sexism. Very often that sexism is laced with racism. Right, so I was telling Ejim earlier, I was at a meeting earlier today in Washington, and I was talking to a U.S. government official, and there was me and another gentleman, and I was literally invisible. I mean, it was quite interesting, and you know, and we're used to that. You know, it's quite funny. You sort of watch.
How many elevators
that's right.
have we been in that they don't notice that we're
that's
there?
Right. You know, so you know, you see that sort of that issue. But we also see a nexus of cronyism and racism, which is, you know, elite white female politicians who are often trying to take over the agenda and speak on behalf of the rest of you know, Afghan women or black women, or what, as opposed to stepping aside and giving them the space to do it for themselves.
Okay, so we're running out of time. I can't believe how fast that time went. And so we have 4 minutes left. And so I want each of you to say in less than 1 minute, we have presidential elections in the United States. We're here in New York. If you were to say anything that you want to the candidates, what would it be? And as I said, it's got to be 1 minute because we've got only 3 left.
I'm going to be just brief. I would say we need to talk about race, and we need to do it now.
So here's what I would say. I have 3 things.
You just got a minute.
Okay.
It's okay.
So I'm going to, this morning for International Women's Day, we circulated a video that one of our members did from the Southern Rural Black Women's Initiative. That's fantastic. So you should go to U.S. Human Rights Network's website and view the video. But she references a quote, and she starts by saying, all women are white, all blacks are men. Obviously, she's trying to say the opposite, and that is exactly what I would tell the presidential candidates. There's nuance. So when you're listening to your advisors, understand that there's nuance and go beyond. On a personal level, I would tell the presidential candidates that I'm worried about my retirement.
I would say a few things. I would say you're looking at looking at the Middle East, which is one of the most violent, dangerous areas in the world. If you want to really, if you're serious about peace and about addressing these problems, listen to the people on the ground, listen to the women on the ground who care and who love their countries, and who are at the front lines of trying to change things. Listen to them. And instead of emailing me and calling me and asking for me to go to fundraisers and pay $500 to go to somebody's house, I invite you to come to my house for tea, for free, to listen to what we have to say, because it's such a critical issue to understand how we can bridge those divisions and come up with very, very pragmatic solutions. But yeah, my message would be listen to what others are saying and recognize that in this country, the beauty of the United States is that you have everyone here. You can have the dream team foreign policy that brings Latin America and Africa and Asia and the Middle East to you in all its diversity and all its creativity, instead of having the same old, often the same, literally old folks doing the work.
Okay, so
And immigration.
And immigration.
And immigration.
Yes.
And militarism.
And militarism. Okay, so we've got 30 seconds.
And
So
human rights.
in that 30 seconds, I would tell them, why don't they come to us and ask us for advice on what their policy should be, and I'm sure that they'll do a much better job than what they're doing right now. So in ending, I think this was a great conversation. I had a great time. And it's really important to bring all these global issues to the forefront and understand the relationship between these global issues and local politics and national politics. I mean, it's not coincidental that the kind of vitriol that's going on in our election right now it's connected to what's happening globally. And so I think to make that global national link is really critical. And I think having feminist voices at every table is necessary. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we can open it up to questions of the live audience.
Thank you.